Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. Kimberly, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Awesome. All right, yeah, so my name is Waylon Chang. I'm going to be the moderator for this session. Welcome everyone to our session on first steps towards funding. I think we have a really nice series of informative talks for you and by a great group of speakers. So I'm really excited about this, and I think we should also have plenty of time for interaction and Q&A afterwards. So hopefully there can be a lot of good discussion here. So without wasting too much time, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce each of our speakers, and then I think we'll hear from each of them in succession and then have our Q&A afterwards. So our first speaker is Dr. David Mintz, who is an associate professor of anesthesiology and critical care medicine at Johns Hopkins University, where he's the division chief for neuroanesthesiology. And he also runs an NIH-funded basic science laboratory that studies the toxic effects of anesthetics in the developing brain. Dr. Mintz also leads the department T32 program. And so it's great to have him here with us today to provide an overview of NIH-supported T32 research and to share his insights into achieving independent funding. Our second speaker is Dr. Harriet Hopf, who is the professor of anesthesiology at the University of Utah and also an adjunct professor of biomedical engineering. She is the immediate past chair of the board of directors for FAIR and continues to serve in various committees, including promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her research, which has been supported by the NIH for over 20 years, focuses on surgical site infection prevention, as well as gender equality, gender equity, and professionalism. And Dr. Hopf is also the recipient of the FAIR Mentoring Excellence in Research Award. And so it's a pleasure to have her here today to give us insights into foundation grants, such as the FAIR Mentored Research Training Grant. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Luci Roberts, who is the NIH Program Director in the Behavioral and Systems Neuroscience branch in the Division of Neuroscience. Dr. Roberts has research expertise and interests in delirium and postoperative cognitive decline, and she manages projects that deal with a range of research areas, including cognition and neuroscience and behavioral research. And so it's a pleasure to have her with us here as well to share about NIH funding, especially in neuroscience, and to field any questions that you may have. And for those of you who don't know me, I am a faculty at Washington University. My lab studies basic mechanisms of ion channel structure and function in anesthetic mechanisms. And I went through a similar path with T32 funding and IRS and NIH grants as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have as well and to share my experience. So Kimberly, if you could go ahead and start us off with the first talk.
Hello, my name is David Mintz. I'm an associate professor at Johns Hopkins and the director of the T32 Fellowship program there. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk generally about NIH career development support, and I'm going to focus specifically on the K08 and K23 mechanisms. I have no commercial disclosures. I do not work for NIH, and I would advise you to take every opportunity to listen to those who do. I do not have a monopoly on wisdom on this topic, or for that matter, any other, and I'm drawing a lot on my own personal experiences and the experiences of those who trained around me. I have not always followed my own advice as laid out in this talk, but I have generally been sorry for that. Before focusing in on the K08 and K23 grants, which are the main topic today, I'd like to just briefly go over some of the key grant types that one could consider for research training and career development. The first group typically are ones that people get after residency, but before attaining faculty status. So the T32 and K12 awards are institutional awards that one can get and use while undergoing fellowship training and coupling it with research training. The F32 is an individual postdoctoral award that you could use as a mechanism to support research training before faculty time. However, it does not include a clinical component. Mentor grants for junior faculty, which are our main focus today, include the KL2, which is mediated through something called a Clinical Translational Science Award given to an institution and then passed out to individuals under the guidance of that institution. The K08 and K23 are grants that you as an individual apply for from NIH. A little bit more advanced than that is the hybrid mentored and independent grant, the K99R00. This is an award that you should consider if you are fairly advanced in your research development, on as junior faculty, and fairly close to scientific independence. And the advantage of it is just that it will save you time. And finally, there are the fully independent Ames-driven grants. This is not an exhaustive list, but the two most common types are the R21, which is an exploratory, high-risk, high-reward grant, and the R01, which is the gold standard 4 or 5 year Ames-driven, project-oriented, mature grant. The K08 and K23 grants are mirror image of one another. One is the Mentored Clinical Scientist Research Career Development Award, and the other is the Mentored Patient-Oriented Research Career Development Award. And NIH tells us that they are designed to prepare clinically trained individuals for careers that have a significant impact on the health-related research needs of the nation, and that they will support and protect time for intensive, supervised research career development experiences. To get a K08 or K23, one must be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, a green card holder. One must have a clinical doctoral degree and a full-time position at a U.S. institution. These awards typically last from 3 to 5 years. They require 75% of one's time be put towards research activities. That's a minimum of 75%, more is permissible. The award budget, all the details, as always with NIH, are specific to the institute. As a general rule, they contain salary and fringe for the PI up to about $100,000 per year of salary. There is a modest level of research support, not more than $50,000 per year, often less, clearly less than one needs to run an independent research project. There is no salary for the mentor, and there is a lower indirect cost rate than on mature research awards at only 8%, not the favorite of deans everywhere. So what are the pros and cons of the K08 and K23 mechanisms? So the most important advantage is that this is a long run of protected research time. Also, it is an important and committed mentorship experience with someone who hopefully can move your scientific career forward. And finally, this is a well-established pathway to scientific independence that chairs and deans and other people in research leadership are very familiar with and highly trusting of. Some of the disadvantages: it's a very limited research budget. You need considerable additional resources either from your scientific mentor or from the department or some combination of both. There's a very strict limit on clinical time, and as we all know in anesthesiology, clinical work and salary tend to be linked. And finally, this is not an easily transferable award. It is permissible to move institutions while on a K award, K08 or K23. However, doing so is easier said than done. So let's talk about timing a little bit. The deadlines for these awards happen 3 times a year, February 12th, June 12th, and October 12th. And keep in mind that NIH does not move particularly quickly. An application funded on the first try may take up to a year to pay out. So when should you apply? Well, first and foremost, at the point at which you need more protected research time. Next important consideration is you have to be in the right environment that will be able to support your research for the period of this grant and ideally well beyond it. This is an important combination of both the mentor that you're working with and the department itself. And you should not look to get an award like this until you've had lengthy discussions with research leadership and the chair to ensure that you have the resources that you would need to carry it out. You should get this type of award when it makes sense for your development as a clinician, and you should also take into account when it makes sense in your personal life. The next question is how to target your application. All NIH institutes have stated missions in terms of the research that they support, and you need to find the right institute that fits your research, which is ideally an institute that has a history of funding related research. You need to find the right study section to evaluate your application. This is one in which experts in the field who can evaluate the science are members of the section. Ideally, it would be a study section that your mentor has previously submitted to and had a funded award from, but at least it should be one where they'll be recognized as an expert. And it's ideal to have a study section which has anesthesiologists on it, or at least clinician scientists. There are a number of resources that you should go to explore these things. The NIH has scientific review officers and program officers who you can consult. The program officers are associated with the institute, and the SROs are specifically associated with the study section. Your own mentors, of course, and other people who've been funded in your field of interest. So these applications have 3 key components that are separately evaluated, and you need to do well on all of them in order to be funded. First up is the project itself. Next is the mentor, and then finally the candidate. So let's talk for a moment about the project. What are the ideal features of a scientific project? And this is not specific to the K08 or K23, but these are sort of general principles. First of all, there has to be novelty. You have to be generating new knowledge. Second, there has to be relevance, and relevance specifically to the mission of the NIH institute you're applying to. Scientific rigor is a key component. You have to use the methodology that is appropriate to getting the results that you are attempting to get. Feasibility is huge. You have to propose work that you can reasonably do with the resources that you demonstrate that you have and in the time period that the award covers. Future potential is really important. In other words, what future scientific work are you setting up with the project that you're doing now? And finally, it's important that this fit within the mentor's lab, but still give you a clear scope for independence. In other words, you can't be perceived to simply be doing the mentor's work, but on the other hand, it has to be clear why the mentor or mentors are the right ones to help support this project. Next, let's talk about the mentor. The NIH tells us that the mentor should be an active investigator in the area of proposed research who is committed both to the career development of the candidate and to the direct supervision of the candidate's research. We're told that the mentor must document the availability of sufficient research support and facilities for high-quality research and must possess substantial experience in mentoring. So what this boils down to is that the ideal mentor is someone who is a researcher in the area that you are working in, who has a large and active research program with all the resources that would be needed to help your project along, and to someone who has had some previous experience and can point to trainees who have been successful under their guidance. In practice, that's a lot to ask from one person, and it's become very common for people to have mentorship teams. Typically, the primary mentor should be the one with the substantial mentorship experience. These are usually associate professors and full professors who can point to a long history of previous trainees who have done well. But within the team, you want to make sure you have all of your bases covered for the project that you're proposing and the career development plan that you're proposing. This includes the science, the methodology and techniques, and the resources. And it is very important to be sure that you have a mentor who can assist you with career development beyond simply the carrying out of the project. So how about the candidate section? This is not a time to be modest, but obviously don't make things up. It's important to answer the question of why you are the right person to become a physician scientist. Both of these, the K08 and K23 awards, are looking to create new physician scientists. It is also very important to show why you are the right person to do the project that you've laid out, and to present a clear and consistent picture of yourself and your virtues and why you are the right person to do this work between all the sections that you write and all the letters that other people submit on your behalf. The candidate section includes a Biosketch, which is a standard NIH format for almost a resume, but you need to tailor it for this application. If you don't have a Biosketch going, get someone to help you with it. And if you do have one going, then it's important to go over it with your mentor and others who are helping you write. Next is the background section, and it's really important to make sure it tells a story that leads up to your project, and that every sentence in it either sells you or shows how you are prepared for this project. And then there are the goals and objectives, which should include concrete plans for future grants, a very heavy emphasis on new skills that are obtained in the course of the grant, and both short and long-term plans. A really important part of the K08 and K23 grants, which doesn't exist in other types of mature research grants, are the career development plans. This is part of the candidate section. There's typically an expectation for some level of didactic training. Sometimes this can take the form of classes. Other times it can even be an entire degree. There should typically be a clear, specific plan laid out for conferences and meetings that you will go to, present your work, and interact with leaders in the field. There should be an accounting of the clinical time. What are you going to do with the clinical time that will not only maintain your skills, but push them forward and continue your development as a clinician in the clinician scientist rubric. Benchmarks and a timeline are also very important, laying out what it is that you will have done and by what time you will have it done in the course of the award. And then finally, there's the pathway to independence. This is the section where you lay out how it is that carrying out this project with this mentor will help you to get to the point where you can sustain your own independent research, including funding. And last but not least, there's a requirement for responsible conduct of research training. Typically, there's a standard pathway at any major institution, and you should consult research leadership in your department to understand what that is. Grant writing is hard work, and one of the hardest things is just getting it going. I would suggest that as you work on your current projects, you think really actively about how any given piece of the data that you're generating would contribute to the grant that you want to write. I recommend starting early and returning to it often. It's also really important to get a copy, or ideally several copies, of funded applications from the same institute and study section that you are targeting. And Get help with this application. This isn't something to do by yourself, but you have to get it early. Send people sections long before the deadline. If you send a final version and ask for critique 3 days before the deadline, it's realistically not going to do you much good other than finding typos. So some tips for writing the science part. The most important questions that you just have to answer first are so what and who cares? And you really can't move on until you have clear answers to those two questions that you can lay out in your specific aims section. You definitely want to start with the specific aims of the grant, and you want to keep revising them as you go along. Typically, what you want to do is modified over time by what you realize you can do with limitations of methodology and technology and resources. One of the hardest parts is balance. You don't want to over-propose. You want to be careful to lay out a project that you should be able to do within the appointed time, but you also want to be ambitious. You don't want anyone to read the grant and say, well, you certainly don't need 3 or 4 years of funded time to do that. It's critically important to make sure that your scientific aims are not interdependent. In other words, that each one is a question unto itself that can be answered without relying on the others. Use the period of time when you are writing other sections, such as career development and Biosketch, etc., to get critique on the scientific part. I would recommend writing the science first and then revising it while you do the other parts of the application. So some tips for writing the other parts of the grant. This is a grant that requires several letters, letters from a mentor, from a chair, and letters from individuals who can attest to your scientific trajectory. I suggest offering to write other people's letters for them, and if that's not what they want, at a minimum, giving them some talking points so that your application all hangs together. Be careful not to neglect the career development section. Some elements of it may be somewhat boilerplate, such as the responsible conduct of research plan, where you're just following a path that's laid out by your own institution. But in general, this is highly individualized and very specific. Use a professional editor, a scientific editor, if you have access to one, and if not, find friends and mentors who are really good at making sure that the language, punctuation, grammar, word choice, etc., are all the best they can be. Start with templates from your mentor or from others who have successfully gotten this type of grant. Biosketch section, environment resources, etc. A lot of these are fairly constant from one grant to the next. Don't reinvent the wheel. A reality of NIH grants is that it's very hard to get one on the first time. These are very competitive. And you should plan to have to resubmit the grant from the very beginning. You want to work actively on the science during the period of time between your submission and resubmission, but be careful not to undercut yourself. You don't want to do the whole project in between the original submission and a resubmission. What you want to work on is proof of principle and supporting evidence for your aims. During the period of resubmission, try to bind yourself as close as you can to the proposed mentors. Try to publish with them if possible. And make sure you can show continuous career development progression during the period of time that you're resubmitting. So in conclusion, the K08 and K23 pathway is a mechanism to protect a solid chunk of time and to build momentum towards an independent physician scientist career for yourself. And it's one that requires departmental support and the support of a mentor, often a mentorship team, in order to carry out, and one that has a specific, unique career development plan designed for you. I want to thank in my own trajectory the large group of mentors that were involved in my own K08 awards. And these are people who spanned the two institutions over which I got and then carried out my K08. A last thought that I'd like to leave you with is that all this takes a lot of time, and you should see it as a process and enjoy the process. As a marker for the passage of time in my own trajectory, over there on the left is what my family looked like at the beginning when I was just thinking about applying for a KO8 and putting it together. And on the right is a picture of my family at the point in time at which I had completed the KO8 and transitioned to an R01. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I'm very happy to entertain questions either in this session or anytime.
And I broke the rules and did not pre-record my talk. I'm sorry, but I do have my slides. So I know Wayland is nervous. I'm going to go over, but I promise I'll stay on time. I'm going to talk about foundation grants as sort of a building block. And in terms of, do I have conflicts of interest? The big one is my long service to FAIR. So I'm going to try not to focus too hard on FAIR, but also incorporate other kinds of foundation grants that you could talk on. As I like to do for my institution, I want to acknowledge that the land that I am working on, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and also to make you a little jealous of where I get to work. Many times, if you think about those first steps towards becoming funded by the NIH with your own R grant or whatever form of funding it is that you're seeking out, PCORI or Department of Defense or whatever, many times you will want to start as doing a fellowship. So you build the training and the data to support moving forward. So I'm going to assume that I am aiming this talk at people who are T32 fellows and are contemplating going from being funded by their mentor to getting some funding for themselves. So you're a T32 fellow, congratulations. Now what do you do next? While you're a T32 fellow, obviously you should learn research skills and collect data, publish, and develop your own research focus. I think a really important part of that T32 training is making sure that part of what you do is identifying your area. And that's partly expertise in that area, but also it's what is going to interest me for the next 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years as I am developing my own research focus. And then you can use that work that you're doing during the T32 as a basis for submitting grants. And the idea behind getting a grant is that you make your own research sustainable, something you can continue to do. K awards are a great place to start. You may find when you're starting out as a T32 fellow, you may not have enough data to get a K award. Dr. Mintz also just elegantly pointed out, it may take you a long time to get that K award. And so what do you do in the meantime? What is something that kind of takes you from that T32 to the K award, which can take a few years? And I'm going to say that foundation grants are a great place to start. I've noticed recently that a lot of people are submitting their foundation grant and their K at the same time, and sometimes they end up getting the K and not needing the foundation grant, which is fabulous, but it also is a source of funding where you can continue to collect data and have support before you apply for that K. When I think about foundation grants, what do they look like? And there's lots of different kinds of foundation grants. I'm talking about these foundational foundation grants aimed at people who are early in their career. And I would say the majority of foundation grants look like this, at least for the foundations I'm going to be talking about. They're usually aimed at early career investigators, and they require a bunch of things that Dr. Mintz has already described in detail. You need to have a mentor or mentors. They usually like it if you have a mentoring team. A research plan. You usually need mentoring and career development plans, which might be the same thing, but often are separate. And you need substantial protected research time in the range of 40 to 75%. Similar to the K award. They also require a lot of institutional support, possibly even more than the K award. The funding is enough to do some research and enough to get some salary, but most institutions end up supporting salary and also investing in the research that you're doing. They have a much better funding line than NIH grants, and so you're more likely to get them. So they're a nice, if you're aiming for the K award right now, it's not a bad idea to take your K award and turn it into a foundation grant, because then you're more likely to get funded before you get that K award to continue to do work. And then the idea behind them is that you're going to get preliminary data, you're going to get training, you're going to get practice that will feed that next level of grant proposals, which might be K or might be R, depending on where you are. When I think about what are the primary anesthesia-related research foundations, it's FAIR, the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research, it's the International Anesthesia Research Society, and it's the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation. And they all have very nice URLs, fair.org, IARS.org, and APSF.org, which I put up here just to remind you, go to their website and you can explore in detail everything I'm going to talk about today. I disclosed earlier in this fabulous day for ESAS that I really like big picture. This talk is a very detail-oriented talk, and I'm going to give you a lot of details. So I'm looking forward to the feedback on whether I've managed to give you the details in a way that you can digest them. But everything I say is on one of these pages. Now what I want to do is just talk a little bit about each of those foundations. I'm going to start with FAIR, partly, of course, because it's near and dear to my heart, although I am engaged with IARS and APSF as well, but also partly because it is the largest funding organization for anesthesia research. The mission of FAIR is to develop the next generation of physician investigators. That's you. I'm very proud to say that since 2010, FAIR has funded $30.5 million across 198 research grants, which is a pretty phenomenal number. And the majority of those, 122, have been mentored research training grants. So I will largely focus on that. I will tell you that over the 35 years of its existence, FAIR has given out $50 million in research funding. It's nice to see that we're accelerating and growing as a foundation so that we can give more grants every year and also larger grants. FAIR has a menu of research grant funding. Recognizing that this is something hard to read, I just wanted to show you that there's a lot of stuff out there. I want to focus on the mentored research training grant. So who can take a mentored research training grant or MRTG? Faculty members who finished your residency training within the past 10 years. It's interested in all areas of research. And if you look through who's been funded, you will see we are truly interested in all areas of research. And so you don't have to feel like you're traditional to get funded. What FAIR really looks at is this important research that's interesting and is going to lead them somewhere in the future. The purpose is to help anesthesiologists develop the skills and preliminary data to become independent investigators. And the funding is $250,000 over 2 years. There's a required 75% protected time to engage in this grant. Now, I just want to talk about the other grants as well. There are fewer of them. The MRTG is really the sort of grant that drives you best towards a K or an R, but there are other opportunities. First is the Research Fellowship Grant, which you can apply for after your CA 1 year. We have people on this call who've taken one. You can focus on any kind of research, and the idea is that you get training. It provides $75,000 for 1 year of funding. And there's a requirement for 80% research time. Now, we get very few research fellowship grants, and I will tell you that the funding rate is very high. So if you are on this call and you are still in training, you may want to consider applying for one of these, recognizing that it does require that you take an extra year in your training to do research. And I think one reason it hasn't been that popular is people are like, I'm just going to move on to the T32 so I can not be at resident salary for the rest of my life. We also have a research and education grant that is technically a mentor training grant, but it is available to faculty members at any rank in recognition that many people are new to educational research. And the goal is to improve the quality and effectiveness of anesthesiology education research. The funding level is smaller. It's about $100,000 over 2 years. And that also reflects that the research commitment is about 40%. We have a Transition to Independence grant. I bring it up only because it exists. We've only actually awarded one since 2010, not because we reject them, but because we don't get them. It's for someone who has had an MRTG grant within the past 2 years and has applied for, but not yet received R-level funding or the equivalent. So maybe we're not getting a lot of these because you're all so successful, but it is an additional 1 year of support as you're reapplying for your R. And then I'm going to talk in detail about the GEMSTAR grant in a minute, but just to point out that it's there. So FAIR we have our own grants, but the other thing that FAIR has been working on over the past few years is jointly funded grants. How can we leverage grants in specific topic areas by pooling resources with other organizations? So the first one is the APSF FAIR MRTG. That has to be focused on patient safety. It's a larger grant. It's $300,000 over 2 years, and it only requires 60% protected time, which is sort of an agreement because APSF grants require less protected time than the FAIR grants. We usually fund those every year. And so if you're doing patient safety research, make sure you look at that APSF FAIR grant because it's a bigger grant. We have an agreement with the American Heart Association for individuals who are doing cardiovascular and or cerebrovascular disease related research. That gives $250,000 over 3 years and requires 50% protected time. We have not yet given one of these. The way it works is if you apply to the AHA and are given a career development award, let us know and we will augment that award from their $219,000 up to $250,000. And so this is just me encouraging you, if you're thinking about applying for a FAIR grant for cardiovascular and or cerebrovascular research, make sure you also submit an AHA grant at the same time. There's a lot of overlap. A relatively new thing is the FAIR American Board of Anesthesiology Research and Education Grant, which is interested in a very narrow area of value and impact of ABA certification programs. It's $100,000 over 2 years and requires 40% protected time. And then there's the GEMSTAR, and GEMSTAR stands for Grants for Early Medical Surgical Specialists Transition to Aging Research. And GEMSTAR is an initiative of the National Institutes on Aging, and they have a career development award, or they have small grant. When they give a small grant, that is an RO3 to a new investigator, they ask for a career development plan, but they do not fund the career development plan. And so what FAIR does is provide supplemental funding of $50,000 over 2 years, requiring 75% of protected time if you get one of those NIA RO3s, so that you get an additional $50,000 above the RO3 that is focused on your training. We've given out a fair number of GEMSTAR grants. A lot of people are going to the National Institutes on Aging, so that's a really great thing to know. I am focusing on all these in a lot of detail because I just think sometimes when you're thinking about what grant to apply for, it's good to have in your mind, oh, wait, there's something that might apply to me. So I hope you're all thinking, oh, I could apply for that one. The IARS has been a longstanding organization founded in 1922. Their mission is much broader than FAIR's. It's the advancement and support of education and scientific resource related to anesthesiology. It's not purely a foundation. It's a research membership organization, but they do have a mentored research award in any area of investigation. It's $175,000 over 2 years and only requires 45% protected time. So here you see where some of the balance comes in, that some awards have a lower protected time, which people find attractive if they want to work more clinically and develop their skills, but they tend to have a little bit less funding in them. The APSF, which was founded in 1985 to advance patient safety, is a foundation, but it's got a big focus on patient safety and then a small focus on funding grants. And their vision is that no one shall be harmed by anesthesia care. They have an investigator-initiated research grant in addition to the APSF FAIR mentored research training grant that's got to be focused on patient safety. It's $150,000 over 2 years and requires 10 to 30% protected time. It is not technically a mentored grant, but I see that they fund a lot of early career investigators. And so I think it's a great place to go if you are doing patient safety research to find some funding to help you develop preliminary data. So now that you're working towards getting funded with your mentor training grant so that you can move on to bigger and better funding with a K or an R or whatever funding that you get to advance your own passions in research. A really important key thing is building a peer network. I, of course, I didn't put it on the slide, but I do want to acknowledge that ESAS is a fabulous place for building your career. And I am so delighted to have seen this grow in spirit and connections over the last few years. And it's just really impressive, the work that you're all doing. There are lots of efforts out there to kind of bring T32 fellows and foundation grant awardees and K fellows together to kind of learn from each other. It's very important to have senior mentors who can help you find your path. I think it's equally important to have peer mentors who are kind of at your level or near your level, and you know what you're going through now, and who don't have that sort of, well, when I was a resident attitude, because they just were a resident just when you were, and can really give you some good, you can sort of mentor each other to be more successful. And then the other thing is, we old people are eventually going to retire or die or move on. And so you are the future of the specialty, and you need to figure out how to be together. So something I'm very proud of that has not gotten as big as we hope, but we're about to get big, I think, is the FAIR MRTG annual meeting. The first one was held in 2019. I'm really excited to say we're holding the second one next week. It got postponed 2 years in a row because of COVID, but we're finally able to be in person. And the goal of the MRTG annual meeting is to create a community of early stage investigators in the context of a 2-day career development workshop. And you can see here the participants in the first MRTG annual meeting. The travel to the meeting is included in your MRTG award, and it is expected that you will attend. And so that's a way that we get people there. I think anyone who attended that will say it was exciting. It was exciting. It was an outstanding opportunity to grow that peer network. And also we bring in people who finished their MRTG a few years ago. So sort of peer mentor networking with the next group, and then a lot of senior mentors, which you can see in this picture. This year, I'm very excited to say that the IARS is funding a number of their mentored research recipients to come to the meeting as well, because they're obviously part of that whole big family. There's different reasons why you might apply to each one. I think it's smart to apply to many places when you've got a grant put together. And so I think ESAS is a great place to network, but also just think about, how do I get together with people who are doing work similar to mine, who are at a similar phase, so we can really share the joys and frustrations of building a career. And having that support can really help you persevere in the face of, really hard work. And then finally, and Dr. Mintz went through some great details about how to put your application together. I'm going to go to a slightly higher level here and say some of the same things he said, but some other things as well on, okay, now you're going to apply for a foundation grant. How can you be successful? So the first thing is apply early. FAIR has application dates February 15th and August 15th. It is not a good idea to say on January 1st, I think I'm going to submit a FAIR grant. It takes much longer than that. Although if you say on January 1st, I'm going to submit a FAIR grant, I'm going to try it again on February 15th, you'll probably be ready by August 15th. So it's not a bad strategy for getting yourself started, which is really the hard part. The next thing is follow the instructions. All of these have very detailed instructions on what you need to include. And the best way to shoot yourself in the foot is to leave out a section or not address the questions in the section. So follow the instructions to make sure that your grant has the best possible opportunity of being seen positively. If you leave something out, A, we're missing the information when the reviewers look at it, but B, it doesn't look very good. If I'm reviewing a grant and they leave something out or they don't address the instructions, I'm a little bit worried about how careful they are in their own research. Is this someone who's going to publish something and have to retract it because they couldn't even submit a grant following the instructions? So please follow the instructions. Make sure you're working closely with your mentors on the proposal. Most institutions offer some kind of grant writing boot camp, really good thing to participate in. Or if you have, a CTSA or something like that, they offer, or maybe your institution has something else, they offer opportunities to submit your grant so that it can get reviewed. I'm going to argue that that's another reason to start early, is so you can submit it to people to review. Dr. Mintz pointed out it's a great thing to get successful examples of grants. One of the things on the FAIR website, when you go there to investigate how am I going to submit this to MRTG, is that there are examples of successful grants that were submitted for MRTG funding and research and education grant funding. And I want to thank the people who were generous enough and brave enough to share their work that was funded so other people can see it. I want you to remember that that mentoring plan and career development plan is as important as the research plan to your grant. That is what I like. The research plan is usually elegant. People have worked really hard on it. Sometimes there's criticism people can have, and maybe it's not quite perfect, but there's you put a lot of emphasis on the proposal. And I agree with Dr. Mintz, you should work on that first. And you should not create your mentoring plan and career development plan the night before it's due. You really want to work on that early, because these grants are judged not just on how good your research is, because there's a little bit of an assumption that part of the goodness of your research comes from your mentors. And so what we're really looking at is, okay, they're doing good research. Are they going to be prepared to take some piece of this and make it their own? You know, how much is this their own research? But also, how prepared are they to move on to the next step? And so you really want to communicate that you are prepared to compete successfully for independent funding. You will be prepared to compete successfully for independent funding when you finish this grant, because of the way you've been mentored and the way you've done career development and the way you've focused on understanding not just the specific skills of how to do the research you're doing, but the bigger skills of how to take the research you've done and the data and look at it and think about what's next. So you really want to emphasize what's next when you're putting together your plan. So that's my kind of whirlwind run through funding that you can get. I will also remind you that there are many organizations that are not anesthesia-related research foundations, but that fund. But if you think about anesthesia research, it's out there in the world. I already talked about the American Heart Association, but you know, the American Lung Association has research mentored grants. If you are doing research and it overlaps with some other discipline, it's not at all a bad idea to look at getting one of their grants. Although you want to look at the instructions carefully, because they might require it to be for cardiologists. I think most places have kind of opened that up now and recognize that anesthesiologists can do research in any area, but that's something to think about. So I wish you all the best for those of you who are in this point of your development at figuring out ways to find the best mentors, find science you love, develop it, apply for these, and then be ready to launch out into the world of independent funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopf, for that information and those insights, and for doing it in very good time. So we'll move on now to hear from Dr. Roberts.
Good afternoon. I'm Luci Roberts, and I'm a program officer at the National Institute on Aging. I'm going to quickly go over some information about how to get started applying for a grant at NIH, and then I'm going to transition us quickly into the question and answer so that we can talk. But before I do that, I have to disclose that I'm a federal employee and I have no financial interest to disclose, and I am not going to discuss off-label or investigational use. So these are the questions I will address in my presentation: how to identify funding opportunities appropriate for early stage investigators, program officers' role in the application process and how applicants should interact with program officers, and then other pearls of wisdom, which will include a plug for NIA's early career programs. So here we go. Now, before I dig into these talking points, let me just start with the forest. How to get started is to go to grants.nih.gov and familiarize yourself with the resources there. There are tutorials and other guidance for people still learning the ropes, and of course, all the tools that you need to apply are there. The NIH guide allows you to search for targeted funding opportunities by keyword, as well as by filtering the list by activity code and et cetera along the left-hand sidebar there. At NIH, we use the term funding opportunity to refer to a call for applications. And we say targeted funding opportunity to refer to a call for applications that's directed to a specific type of science or a certain group of applicants. And this is an important distinction because NIH is somewhat unique among public funders in that the agency is not entirely driven by targeted funding opportunities. Many science agencies operate exclusively by publishing time-limited calls for applications on a specific disease or area of science. The NIH Guide is your tool to look for those targeted funding opportunities, and there are thousands of active FOAs published in the guide at any given time. NIH also has parent funding opportunities for our most heavily utilized grant activities like the R01 Research Project Grant. An investigator can submit an application on almost any health-related science topic, and from the most basic research all the way up to early phase clinical trials. We call these investigator-initiated applications because they're submitted under the parent funding opportunity and not in response to a targeted funding opportunity. Around half of the awards that NIH makes every year are investigator-initiated topics. So you don't have to have a targeted funding opportunity to apply for a grant at NIH. Let me also take a moment here to tell you that if you are just getting started in your research, in your search for training and career development opportunities at NIH, the place to begin is the Research Training and Career Development website. It's a compilation of all the training and career development programs at NIH, including fellowships, career development awards, diversity programs, and it even links over to training programs offered by NIH's intramural research program. The URL is very simply researchtraining.nih.gov. Now, back to my talking points, the first being how to identify funding opportunities appropriate for ESIs. And instead of starting with the resources that I just showed you at grants.nih.gov, I suggest that you start with the early career resources on a few of the Institute's websites. And the reason that I say that is that sometimes the resources at grants.nih.gov are so large, and much of it may not be applicable to you because of your discipline or your stage of career. So it can be a little like a needle in a haystack. I'm going to suggest a different strategy and give it a try and let me know if you think it helps. My advice is to identify a small number of target institutes. And since you are all anesthesiologists, the list obviously starts with the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, NIGMS, and the Aging Institute. And there may be others, and I can show you how to explore that in just a moment. But many, if not all of the institutes, have a web page dedicated to early career investigators. And that web page lists the programs that the Institute participates in, including those that it's developed to cultivate the careers of investigators in their own field. At NIA, we have the GEMSTAR program, Beeson Career Development Awards, and pilot awards that are available under the Pepper Center, the Alzheimer's Disease Research Centers, and etc. And I'll share some of those programs with you in just a moment. I also encourage you to talk to at least one PO at your target ICs to ensure that you found everything and to get advice that's specific to you. And also, don't forget about these high-risk, high-reward programs listed in the last bullet on my slide. They're NIH-wide and they're very highly competitive and selective, but there are people in this audience who are a good fit for some of these, so don't count them out. Now, these are screenshots of the early career websites at NHLBI on the left and NIA on the right. The URLs are shown at the bottom so that you can see where in the sitemap these websites tend to be found. Now, in case you have not found the Matchmaker tool yet, it is definitely one to know about. It's found on the NIH Reporter website, and under the Matchmaker tab, you'll find a text box where you can copy and paste your abstract and specific aims or other descriptive text that's related to your research concept. Matchmaker will return a list of the recently funded awards with project descriptions most similar to the text you pasted into the box. It also reports on the most prevalent ICs assigned to these projects, as well as the activity codes and the study sections associated with the applications. The bars in each of the histograms are filters that will narrow the results down to just your selection. So if you're interested in only seeing the hits from NIA, you can click on the NIA bar in the histogram and it will set a filter. The Matchmaker also offers searches for program officials and cross-references the specific grants from the hit list that are in their portfolio. So you can just look for yourself to see whether their portfolio is a good fit for your concept by looking at the funded grants that are in their portfolio. Now, when you do reach out to a program officer, I encourage you to send a specific aims page and a current Biosketch. That gives the PO enough information about you to help you identify suitable early career programs and to understand your research topic. But don't send more than that because POs just don't have time to look at it, and they really should not be getting into such a fine level of detail on individual applications for obvious reasons. Now, this interaction could be just an email exchange, but if you send enumerated questions, you should get a detailed response. Now, when you have decided to submit an application and are closer to the receipt date for that application, contact a PO again a couple of months ahead of time to set up an appointment. You need to have this meeting because you will have questions, but build in lead time because you may not get an appointment right away. Please don't try to have a personal meeting to discuss your application at a scientific conference. It's often difficult to find a private place to meet, and this should be a confidential conversation. Also, it may be more difficult for the PO to find resources on the NIH website that they want to share if they're working from a public location on a public Wi-Fi. Now, once your application is submitted, most PIs don't have a reason to contact the PO again until their summary statement comes out. However, if you think your application is being misdirected in some way and you're not happy with the answers that you're getting from peer review staff, you can call us for advice about what to do. POs are here to help you apply for grants. We can help you understand the very expansive information on the NIH website, but we can't provide individual instructions on how to apply for a grant. There should be a course offered by your institution or professional society, and we often attend those to help out with this. NIA also has a training program for grantsmanship that I'll share with you in just a bit. POs can help you find funding opportunities, but we don't have an exhaustive list because they're changing every day. We can review your aims and point to areas that strike us as potential areas of concern for reviewers, but we can't advise you about how to resolve those potential areas of concern, and we won't be able to identify every weakness in your application. Now, once your summary statement comes out, we can offer advice on how to respond to concerns in a general way, but we can't give specific advice on how to respond to criticisms. And I know this seems like a whole lot of what good is a PO, but you'd be surprised at the number of times I've been able to interpret a comment in a way the investigator had not thought of. Sometimes it's difficult to read a summary statement objectively after having put so much of yourself into the application. POs are good at helping with this. So now we've arrived at the pearls of wisdom part of this presentation. So please indulge me while I share some of NIA's signature programs for early career investigators, starting with NIA's GEMSTAR program, which is to provide support for early career physician scientists to launch careers as future leaders in aging or geriatric focused research. The GEMSTAR provides small grants under the R03 activity code to conduct transdisciplinary aging research and develop pilot data and research experience to support subsequent aging research projects. Now, this is an RO3 that allows for 100,000 in direct costs per year over 2 years, which is double the budget allowable under the parent RO3s. Applications are accepted once per year for this program, and the receipt date is typically in October. Now, this is an allocation-based RFA, meaning that there are dedicated funds for the program and the applications are paid until the funds run out. So there's not a pay line in force. In fact, the program has a high award rate, 35% in 2021. There's another RO3 program at NIA for Alzheimer's disease research that is not limited to physicians. And it also has a budget cap of 100,000 in direct costs per year for 2 years. This is the next generation of researchers in Alzheimer's disease research, and it is a set of 3 companion FOAs, one for secondary analysis of existing data sets, one for basic science, and a third for systems biology. Applications for this program are accepted 3 times per year on the standard RO3 receipt dates, and there's also an allocation for this program. The Paul Beeson Award is NIA's Career Development Award program for early stage physicians and other health professional investigators who've shown leadership and commitment to aging research. The Beeson program's purpose is to recruit early stage investigators who've successfully competed for a research grant, like the GEMSTAR, and thus have already begun to establish a research program. The intention of the Beeson program is to cultivate emerging leaders to be poised to make a transformative impact on the health of older adults. The budget for the Beeson program is $225,000 per year in direct costs for up to 5 years. And this is somewhat larger than a traditional K award, such that it will actually allow for partial support of a research coordinator or clinical trials coordinator and additional funds for research materials or enrollment costs. Candidates must have a research or clinical doctoral degree. A new program that is just getting off the ground at NIH is the CATS Early Stage Investigator Research Project Grant. This is an early stage RO1 to support an innovative project in an area of science that represents a change in research direction for an early stage investigator and for which no preliminary data exist. The applications are reviewed with other CATS applications in regular CSR study sections. The novel aspect of the award is not only are no preliminary data required, none are allowed. If preliminary data exist that are unpublished and the application is not eligible for the CATS program, the concept you are proposing should represent a substantial change in research direction for the PI and a description of the manner in which the research represents a change in research direction is a required element of the application that will be peer reviewed. The program objectives are a bit lengthy, so please be sure to read the funding opportunity carefully and contact a program officer. Finally, I want to tell you about NIA's 3-day workshop for investigators who are new to aging research, the Butler-Williams Scholars Program. Unfortunately, the application deadline for this year is coming up very quickly. But if you don't have time to apply this year, please subscribe to the NIA blog so that you can receive the application materials when they come out next year. The Butler-Williams program involves sessions on different types of geriatrics and Alzheimer's disease research, grantsmanship, and much more, including mock study sections. My final point is this. Don't try to do everything yourself. Find people who have experience and are willing to help you. And last, please remember that it's a program officer's job to help you. And I can tell you from my interactions with POs that they would not be in this position if they didn't want to help you. They do have other choices. If you contact a PO and they don't get back to you promptly, it's because POs receive a lot of email. If that happens, please don't interpret it as an ignored email, as disinterest. If you don't get an answer within a few days, please send a reminder. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, and to all of our panelists. I think we have plenty of time here for discussion, and any questions that people may have. So yeah, I'd encourage you to go ahead and just unmute and ask your question. You can also type in the chat box, but yeah, I think it'd be great if people can ask their questions directly as well. I can start us
personally
off.
would love to see some people's faces. It feels so weird to just have the Jeopardy squares.
I can start us off with something that came to my mind as we were talking about foundation grants and K08 and the timing for applying for those. I think we mentioned about, potentially you may not be ready for the K08 and you could try for the foundation grant. I don't know if our panelists could give a little more concrete information about, what are some of the milestones or some of the issues that you want to consider for whether or not you'd be ready for a K08, or whether you should apply for both at the same time, or hold off and just try for a foundation grant first.
I'll throw it out there. We do have an NIH program officer. That would be a great question in terms of, for Lucy, I think of when you cross that border. But I will put my 2 cents in that the K08 and K23 requires a solid amount of really high quality preliminary data. And in particular, it requires that you show that you have all the techniques or methodology ready to go. In other words, none of that is prospective. You are able to carry the science out. You can leave a few things to imagination, I guess, but that I think is the hardest barrier to achieve. And really part of where the foundation grants are really helpful is to buy people time to do that, because they require a 2-year set of experiments. That's a lot less technique and methodology, and gives you it's much more likely you'll have that at the end of a T32 than that you'll have 4 to 5 years worth of stuff accrued.
Thank you. I don't like to generalize, and I think it's a really good idea to contact a program officer and have a look at your biographical sketch. But, I think it depends upon how much research experience you come into an early faculty position with. If you have an established publication record and possibly some preliminary data or some published data from a previous research study that you want to use as preliminary evidence and scientific, a conceptual framework, we're not supposed to say premise anymore, but a conceptual framework to support an application, then I think it's fine to go ahead and apply for the K08 at the time that you need it, keeping in mind that it may take 18 months to actually get it. But if you don't have preliminary data, or let's say you're changing research directions, and so the publication record that you already have doesn't support what you want to do and where you want to go with your career, then a foundation grant or some other, like a GemStar, is probably advised.
And I'm going to go to sort of the strategic level, which is we know grants usually often maybe don't get funded on the first try. So, as Lucy just said, it could be 18 months before you get funding. For the FAIR grant cycle, the grants are submitted February 15th, and then you'll be notified after the spring board meeting in May if you got it or not, and then you get funded July 1st. So it's a much quicker turnaround. And so I am seeing a lot of people who seem to be applying to both at the same time. And I will say, if you're kind of almost K ready or K ready and you submit your K, you probably are more likely to get one of the foundation grants, because you've got a very advanced proposal. And so that's a good way to maybe get some funding to bridge you to like getting more preliminary data, having time to get more publications out there, because you don't want to be in that situation where you get to the end of your T32, it's only 2 years or whatever it is you're doing for a fellowship, and you're applying for the K maybe in your second year, but now you're going to have a gap. So the foundation is a nice way to fill that gap and to help you develop data so that you're not continuously reliant on your institution. Given that, I hope your institutions are giving you lots of support.
For people who decide to start pursuing research maybe a little later on in life than starting out with like an MD, PhD or something like that, I know for the FAIR grant, you have to apply for the MRTG within the first 10 years of practice. Is there any similar restriction on the K award or on having early investigator status, or is that more specifically based on the amount of work you've done in that area?
Yeah, look at the funding opportunity carefully. For example, the K99, you have to apply for the K99 within 4 years of your fellowship or your your final training program. But the K08 and the other mentored Ks, I believe the wording in the funding opportunities is early career, and that is intentionally to avoid limiting it to the early stage investigator status. But be very careful in reading the requirements, because again, we have many different K awards, and different ICs implement them differently. But NIA tries to consider as many people eligible as possible. So we're pretty generous that way.
Can I ask a question? I think any of you honestly could answer it, just for all the trainees on. One thing to think about is strategy, and you guys have all somewhat talked about that. But when would it be beneficial for a individual to try to get on a departmental T32 versus going for the FAIR versus going for a K award? Like, what are your guys' thoughts on that? Like, what's the best strategy to move forward? Because obviously each has its own things. Is there a certain profile of a person that you think would fit one versus the other?
I'm happy to start that off talking about the T32. At least at Hopkins, and I think this is more or less consistent, what we're looking for are people who are ready to commit the time to research and who have checked off the boxes for whatever the other priorities are. They've done their clinical fellowship or are happy to postpone doing it. They have, they're at a point in time in their life where this is mostly what they want to do. And, typically if you already have a bunch of research done and preliminary data and a mentorship team built, then you can move on from that stage. But it's the point in time at which someone is committed, but hasn't built the infrastructure around them to progress.
And I sort of think of this as, it's not like an and or, it's sort of an all at the same time, and not necessarily all at the same time, but it may be true if you have an MD PhD and you've done some training there, you don't have as much need. Although I will say, when your MD PhD, your PhD was a long time ago by the time you get to the end of anesthesia training, so it probably makes sense to do a T32. To me, the T32 provides funding while you're putting stuff together, and I think for most people, as an anesthesia resident or as a clinical fellow, you don't have a ton of extra time to be applying for that foundation grant or for that K award, and you probably don't have the preliminary data. So the T32 is a great way to do that. I know Dr. Mintz is kind of going, yeah, but I don't want people doing my T32 for 1 year, because then I'm going to get dinged because they didn't do it for 2 years. But I do think that the NIH gives you grace if they did it for 1 year and then went off because they got a K. So, to my mind, I think the T is a great way to give you protected time and training and time to collect data. And if you happen to come into early, you've just joined the faculty and you have tons of preliminary data and you're ready to submit a K, great. I just don't think that is usually the case.
I'd agree,
especially if you're that late starter person, who are spectacularly valuable people in research, by the way.
The T32s are administered by the institution. So they're awarded by NIH, but the slots are administered by the institutions. And the criteria and the specific way in which they use those slots can vary. They're not all for physician scientists. You know, some of the T32 programs are broader than that. So I would talk to the PI who administers the specific T32 that you're interested in to find out more about the program and who are the ideal candidates. But generally speaking, they do tend to be earlier career opportunities than the individual fellowships and the individual career development awards.
Yeah, thanks for that information. I guess I've even kind of thought of it almost like, you know, a lot of the medicine specialties, they have a fellowship, which is 2 or 3 years, which half of it's research. In anesthesia, we have nothing similar. So I've kind of almost started, even in our department, I'm not a PI on it or anything, but even thinking for our, you know, some of these academic scholars tracks, a lot of the institutions use that as almost like a fellowship, but not a fellowship, if you will. So it's probably a good mechanism for that. So thanks for all 3 of your perspectives.
So I'll ask a question that was sort of in my head, but several people have actually commented about this in the chat as well, as the K99 ROO mechanism. I was wondering, Dr. Roberts, if you could just explain a little bit about what that is and you know, what sort of candidates might be appropriate for that.
The K99 program is not topically limited. It's one of the trans NIH programs. I don't think it's limited by specialty. There tend to be more of them for basic science because the way it's set up, it's you have to apply within 4 years. And so it's really sort of intended for that more research intensive, high publication rate kind of research program. But I do have PIs in my portfolio who have come through as K99 ROO. The interesting thing about it is that the K99 is for 2 years, and then if you transition to an ROO, which is an RO1-like grant that gives you 3 years of startup money for a faculty position. But you're right that it is less typical for physicians to apply for the K99 ROO.
This may be a very, I don't know, difficult or complex or too specific question to answer, but in kind of all of these different grant mechanisms, is the track record of publishing or the sort of track record of preliminary data more important? And is it worth applying before you've had a chance to actually publish the preliminary data, but you have the data in hand?
Yeah, I don't think that one is more important than the other. I think that it's good to have at least a few publications under your belt, and anything that you haven't published that you can use as preliminary data to support the feasibility and provide evidence for the soundness of the conceptual framework for your application, the better. I think that, you know, what you can do is just sort of go through and look at what kinds of accomplishments that you have that can support application. And, you know, I don't want you to compare yourself to other people, but just sort of think about whether you think that that's similar to other people that you know that have been successful in applying for one of the K awards. Look at awarded K applications that are similar to what you want to. I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. Should I turn off my camera?
You're back to totally stable right now.
Okay, all right. Well, let me know. I can turn off my camera. But what I was saying is, if you go into Matchmaker and pull up a hit list of other K awardees, there are going to be people in there that you know. And you know, if they're into their K award a couple of years or more, they're probably going to be perfectly happy to share their application with you and talk to you about their experience. And you'll be able to see the Biosketch that they submitted on their application. And you know, that way you don't have to directly compare, but you can just get an idea of where they were in their careers.
Kimberly, I think you asked a really great question that I think everyone struggles with when they write grants, which is, should I, you know, what's the point at which I have enough? But I think there are really two distinct questions. The first question is, do I, as a candidate for a career development award, have enough of a track record of publication of anything, not necessarily specifically geared towards this application, the science in this application? That's a really key question. And certainly we've seen people dinged for, you know, not having done enough science. And this can be hard for anesthesiologists because we disappear into these very clinically rigorous residencies and fellowships where there's not a lot of opportunity to publish. And, you know, in comparison to people, say, in internal medicine who have these great tracks built where they can continue some level of academic productivity more easily. So I do think one of the big messages for folks is try to put points on the board as you go along, you know, take the opportunities that you can to gain authorship and to do the things that, you know, what are you being asked to do? You're being asked to demonstrate that you have the ability to put a manuscript together, which, as you know, is hard and it's not intuitive. Then there's the separate question of, do I have enough so that I can go forward with this application between published things and preliminary data? And keep in mind there, the mentors published data, even without you, can support the science and support the ability to do the techniques. It's great to have things published in the vein of the research that you want to do, but I don't think the experience is that you have to have, you know, multiple publications leading right up to this topic necessarily. One or two might be plenty, as long as you have other evidence that you are able to do that part of the job. Does that seem fair to the other panelists?
Yeah, I would echo what Dr. Mintz said as well, in that my experience with the KOA, and I know of several colleagues as well, where we had minimal publication record in the field that we're proposing in, and in fact, minimal preliminary data as well, but a substantial publication record previously, maybe from a PhD or during residency. And I think that goes a long way for a training grant, even a KOA.
And I'm going to say, you know, if you have compelling science, that probably is a bigger drive. Like, yes, you have to have publications, you have to have some things, but I think that a lot of the reviewers are, as I said, they're very much focused on your development plan and where you've gotten to so far. But if you have really well argued science and a really well executed plan for what you're going to do with it, I think that's going to, you know, so I think you need to focus on both. Like, don't spend all your time getting publications and then put some half-baked idea up and think that because you have all those publications, you're going to get funded. So you kind of need all those threads going on at once.
Any other questions in our last few moments here?
Yeah, I have a very quick question, and it's a very general question to Dr. It's actually a general question to so anyone can answer. But I've read Dr. Mintz's work on the neurocortical neurons, and I'm a big fan of that. So my question is going to be, like I said, general question. I wanted to know, what would someone at your level, like let's say you graduate at medical school and you just finish your residency. Right now, I'm doing a T32. I finished medical school abroad. I finished medical school in Sudan, Africa, and I did internal medicine. I did intensive care for 4 years over there, and now I'm doing a T32 here at Pittsburgh. My question is, let's say you finished medical school and you finished your residency program. What would you do differently? And this question is really for everyone. Like, what would you do? Not differently, but let's say like the time goes back, and what would you do now? You know, just to get to where you are at right now, maybe shorter, or maybe to get, let's say like maybe even a higher place or something like that. This is, I don't know. I hope this question makes sense. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to defer to Dr. Mintz and Dr. Hopf since I have a PhD and not an MD, so I really don't have any practical experience to share.
Wow, that's a hard question. And thanks for the noting yourself as a fan. I don't get a lot of fans for neuroanesthesia toxicity work, mostly hate mail from surgeons about how that's a bad thing to study. So I think for me, probably the biggest hiccup that I can look back on is I transitioned between different institutions on the eve of getting a KO8. It started for like 1 month at one place, and then the rest went on the next place. And that was terribly disruptive. I had a 7-day plan to start the lab back up again at Hopkins. And it took about 8 months. So that was bad and very nerve-wracking, to say the least. I'm not totally sure how I would have arranged things differently, but I think the point of having the right environment and I loved Columbia, and the reasons I left had nothing to do with science environment. But if I could go back, maybe I would have made the transition and then applied for the grant. That probably would have been smarter.
So I'm gonna say I don't know if I'm looking back on what I should have done differently, because it was literally in the last millennium, and so I can't remember what I should have done differently. But I will say I think one thing to focus on is when you're selecting your mentors, really assessing what they bring and what they're going to give for you. And I think one of the things that I see people doing a lot is there are some labs that are extraordinarily productive, which is great, and you can go there, but look and see recent people who have recently sort of moved on from that lab and gone and done something else. Has that mentor focused on your development as an individual investigator, or have they focused on your making their research bigger? And so I think finding a mentor who's really going to help prepare you to do your own research, rather than who's going to prepare you to do a specific line of research that will support them, is critically important. And it's easy to get sort of distracted by a place where you know you're going to get tons of publications. And we were just talking about this for the K Award, right? Like, oh, I'm going to get tons of publications, so I'm going to get a K Award. Yes, but will you be, independence ready? I think that's something really, really to think about, is how that mentor develops people, and if it's going to get you to where you want to go. And of course, they should also be productive. I'm not saying you should choose a mentor who's not productive, but just sort of really focusing on how do I find my own path is important.
All right, I think we have a little bit of flexibility in our time. So if anyone does have one or more questions, we could take it. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up. Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I just want to acknowledge that Brad Fritz, Kimberly Ringel, and Kristen Howard did an excellent job of organizing this session. So very grateful to them for this, and to all of our panelists. So thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Those of you who are going to be staying on for our business meeting, we're actually going to transition to that short momentarily. So you can stay right here on this Zoom link. But thank you to all the speakers again. We really, really appreciate all of your support and your work. And a big shout out again to Kristen and the rest of the team behind the scenes.